Now it's time for Florida. This encounter comes from phantomsandmonsters.com. Around 1991, my mother, one of my cousins, and I were coming back from a school concert. At the time, we lived in a rural part of the county. We were 3 miles from our home when my mother hit the brakes real hard. I was in the back seat sleeping, and my cousin was sleeping in the front passenger seat. I heard a hard thump, and then Mom hit the gas. I asked what happened. She screamed out, "I just hit a werewolf!" My cousin's eyes were wide open and she wouldn't talk at all. My mother told me more details when we got home. Before she hit it, she noticed a car on the side of the road up ahead. When she came up to it, the creature jumped right in front of her car. She was going about 45 when she hit the brakes. It landed on the hood of the car. Its face landed on the windshield. It had black fur and red eyes, a long mouth open to reveal a large set of teeth. Definitely not a guy in a suit. It pushed itself off the car, leaving claw marks. My mother told me that the last time there was one in the area was over 20 years ago. This person's next story comes from 2001. I worked maintenance between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. For about a week I heard weird sounds coming from the back of the building, which has thick brush. Not the typical animal sounds. One night I heard a loud crash coming from the side entrance. I investigated to find a large garbage can was thrown on top of the roof and rolled off. I was thinking kids until I got a strong whiff of something nasty. It wasn't the trash. Then I was thinking skunk ape. I quickly picked up all the trash and went back into the building. The next night, I was traveling between the two buildings when the thick brushes started shaking. I heard an animal make a horrible sound, like it was being choked. I ran into the lighted parking lot and turned around. I saw a large humanoid shape appear out of the brush, and it went back in. A couple nights later, my mother was waiting to pick me up when she saw a large shape come in under a light by a side entrance. It suddenly noticed her and went back into the shadows. A week passed without incident. Again my mother was waiting to pick me up when she heard a couple of dogs barking close by. She turned to see a large hooded man walking behind the car. He was across the parking lot on the other side of the road. The dogs belonged to a couple of trailer folks nearby. These dogs travel in a pack of 4 to 5 and weigh between 60 and 90 pounds. They were running around the man, barking and snapping at him. One of the large dogs got hold of his arm. Then my mother saw the man's face. It wasn't a man under that hood. A head of a black wolf became visible. The unearthly being shook and then threw that dog like a doll. The rest of the dogs ran for their lives. The hooded creature walked into the nearby woods. The next night was a full moon, and I heard its unearthly howl. We never heard or saw it again. Now a housing project occupies the land where it once lived. This is the kind of story that really makes you think there is truly a part man in the man-wolf stories, but what that part really, truly is, it's hard to say. This story comes from the Unexplained Mysteries forum. I was traveling Highway 10 from West Coast to South Florida. I was with my 6 kids and pulling a trailer with all my belongings and 3 dogs. I was in a big SUV. It was around 2 a.m. The kids were all asleep and my daughter, about 13 years old, was in the passenger seat to make sure I stayed awake. So after traveling Highway 10 for 3 days, I had decided since we reached Florida, we would cut through the state to save some time. So we got off Highway 10 on an off-road in hopes of getting gas and making some time. It was along the Route 27 Apalachicola National Forest. We came to the first little gas station. It was closed. I was nervous. We needed gas. So we continued on. I told my daughter to keep an eye out for deer crossing the 2-lane deserted highway, because hitting a deer could kill us all and turn us over due to the trailer we were pulling. We were traveling around 45 miles an hour. I remember this so clearly, like it was yesterday, but it was 3 years ago. We had our brights on because the road was dark and winding. A few houses, but not many. As we came around a corner, in the headlights on the road was a lot of blood, fresh blood, and on the side of the road was this 6 or 7 foot tall thing, light like a deer, but on its hind legs, hunched over a dead deer, eating it. It did not look up, not even when my headlights hit it. It was using its arms like a human eating the deer. It had a very muscular body, pointing ears, and a long muzzle. If you ever saw a werewolf, this was it. Skinnier lower body, but use arms and hands just like a human. If it had looked up, I would have died. I looked over at my daughter, and we were both seeing the same thing at the same time. Tears came to my eyes instantly, and at the same time we both said, "Werewolf." I sped up. I was scared it would run, jump on my trailer and kill my dogs. As we got about a mile away, my heart was beating so hard. My daughter and I were so freaked out. It was a werewolf. I have never been a believer in werewolves. I don't watch movies or have any reason to make this up. And as a matter of fact, until today, I've only told a handful of people. There's a werewolf in Florida. Not sure of exact town or road, but I wish I did know so I could find out if we were the only ones to have seen this thing. I will live my life wondering. This report comes from phantomsandmonsters.com. My oldest son and his wife were traveling from Daytona Beach on Highway 100 towards Ocala. They were driving a work van with a trailer going around 60 miles per hour at around midnight. There were no lights on the road, but their headlights illuminated a creature standing on the side of the road, looking across toward the other side. As they were approaching, it never looked into the headlights, but kept staring across the road. The description was a bipedal, wolf-like creature that appeared to be predominantly bare-skinned, though there was hair on some parts of the body. They described the face as evil, with visible teeth. My son stated that it was every bit as tall as the van he was driving. They continued on their way, praying that they would not break down. My youngest son was driving home along the same route he did every night. This was in Polk County, Florida. It was around 1:30 a.m. On consecutive nights, while traveling on the same stretch of road, a wolf-like creature ran in front of his car on all fours. It was huge. Its back was 4 foot from the ground, and it had a large, well-developed muscular chest, which tapered dramatically towards abdomen and flanks. It also had a large, bushy tail. This next story also comes from phantomsandmonsters.com. It was June, I think, and around 9 p.m. I was out back on the patio. At that time, no one had fences around their property because all of us knew the other families around the area. The only exception was the family across the street from us. They had a 7-foot-tall cinder block wall behind their house. They had a large wooded piece of property and kept equipment out there. The dad was in construction, and the wall enclosed 3 sides of the property. It was hot out and a slight breeze, no clouds, and starry. As I sat there, you could hear the dogs in the neighborhood beginning to bark. Then everything got quiet. A lone howl started, so I howled back. I do this rather well. I'd watch National Geographic and I would mimic wolf cries. Anyway, this went on for about 5 minutes. Each time the howl from the other end got closer. Down the road are train tracks that run north to south. The sound seemed to come from that direction. I started to get spooked as the howling stopped. Our yard has bushes and a tree on the side where the sound came from. The hair on my arms and neck started to stand up, so I felt like I should go in. As I stood, I heard movement by the bushes. I glanced over and saw something move. I didn't wait to see what it was. I booked it into the house and I stood by the door, which has glass panes in it. I watched as something very large and dark moved about the bushes. It moved away and I could no longer see it from my vantage point. I went to the front porch to look out the windows, hoping to get a look at whatever was there, but it never came out that way. So I went to bed and read for a while to calm down. Less than an hour later, my brother came home. He came to my room and was as white as paper. He was shaking all over. His eyes were the size of saucers. I asked him if he was okay. Now, my brother is the sort that has an explanation for anything unusual. He's a big guy, so for him to be in this state was not normal. He said, "I need you to come with me right now. I'll explain when we get into the truck." I was still dressed, so I got up and went with him. When we got outside, I asked what's going on. He told me there was something in the road by the tracks that he needed to show me first. I was not happy about that, as I just had my own experience with something from that direction. As we got there, it looked as if something had exploded all over the road. There was blood everywhere, as if something was mowed down in that spot, but there were no body parts anywhere. My brother then related what he had seen coming down the road. I was coming home, and as I got closer to the tracks, there was this huge thing lying in the road. I thought it must have been a Mastiff or Great Dane in the road, but as I pulled up to it, it didn't look like a dog I've ever seen. It was hairy. Its head and nose was twice the size of a dog. The body wasn't a dog, just dog-like, but much, much bigger. It was all over the place. There was an arm on the road. Not dog, a human arm. There was no trace of anything when we got there, and it was only minutes that it took us to get there. I said to get the hell out of there now, and we went back home. I told him what I had experienced just before he got home. A couple of days later, my sister came to me and said she has been seeing a large dog prowling around at night. It was huge, and she had seen it across the street as she sat on the porch. I told her what my brother and I saw, and not to be outside until we could find out what it was. We got together and decided to stake out the yard over the next night. Sure enough, it was back in the neighbor's yard. The thing was about the size of a Shetland pony, black in color. We had flashlights, and when we turned them on it, it took off to the back wall behind the house. Their dog was going off like crazy. They had a small terrier. We watched this dog thing scale the wall. The neighbor came out to see what was going on, and we shouted there was something in his yard. He went back in and grabbed his pistol and went around back, but by that time it was gone. This is such a peculiar story. It's almost like this Dogman was mowed down by a train and then put back together again, which kind of makes you think about the Mansi people in Russia and their legends of the Menk, what they call a huge werewolf that can be rebuilt using parts of its destroyed kin. Interesting.
I have a story to tell you that is quite frightening and hard to believe. I grew up in Florida in the 70s and 80s until I went to college and moved away. I now live in California, but that's not the story. When I was a kid, my dad's best friend, and I'll call him Mike, but that is not his real name, he was a Florida highway patrolman. They had been friends since they were kids, and our families were really close. Christmas, birthdays, any chance we had, our families were together. It was like we were one big family. Anyway, I was probably 13 or 14. I can't remember exactly, but I remember the conversation my dad and Mike had. I was sitting in the living room one evening when Mike came by to see my dad. I had answered the door to let him in, and I noticed the smell of alcohol when he came in. He wasn't drunk, but you could tell he had been drinking, which was really unusual for him. My dad came into the living room and asked what was wrong, and Mike said he needed to talk to my dad in private. So they walked back into my dad's den and shut the door. Now, the one thing about our house was you could go in the bathroom and stand on the toilet and listen through the air vent and hear everything that was being said in my dad's den. So being a nosy teenage girl, that's what I did. Dad asked Mike why he was drinking and out on the roads and if anything was wrong and was his family okay. Mike said, "No, that's not it." And then he said, "I saw something last night, Turtle. Something that should not exist." Turtle had been my dad's nickname since he was a kid because he was fascinated by turtles. He told my dad he was patrolling on Highway 490 just outside of Homosassa around 1:30 in the morning. He said he could see a car on the road up ahead with its flashers on and thought someone had broke down. When he got up there, a guy in his 20s came running up to his car screaming. Mike got out and could smell marijuana on the boy and also alcohol, and the boy was screaming, "I hit a monster." He told Dad he thought the guy was maybe on some hallucinogen and immediately put him in handcuffs and put him in the back of his patrol car. He said he walked up to the guy's car and could see the front was smashed in, like the guy had hit another car. It was damaged that much. He started to shine his flashlight around, but didn't see anything, but then noticed blood on the highway and a trail of blood going to the side of the road. He walked to where it went off the road and saw something laying just off the road. He told Dad at first he thought it was a bear, so he pulled his gun out and walked up to it. At this point, Mike almost was in tears, and my dad was telling him it would be okay to just let it out. Mike said, "Turtle, it was a werewolf." My dad said, "Mike, you have to be mistaken. It had to be a bear or something. There's no such things as werewolves." Mike started to get a little annoyed and he said, "I'm telling you it was a werewolf and it wasn't dead." He said, "Turtle, that thing looked up at me." And Dad asked him, "What did he do?" And he said, "I shot it 2 times in the head." He said that he was afraid that it was going to get up and that it was huge. He said a deputy showed up and came running over to where Mike was standing, and he started to freak out a little also. They went back to Mike's car and opened the door and asked the guy what happened and what that thing was. The guy said he was driving when this thing just ran out in the road and he hit it. He said it staggered over to the edge and fell. The kid said at first he thought he hit a person because it was standing upright, and so he got out of the car and ran over to it. He told Mike that's when he noticed him coming down the road. They radioed in and more officers arrived, and the shift supervisor told Mike he would need to make out a report. Mike asked him about the guy sitting in his car, and the supervisor told Mike that one of the deputies would transport him and that the guy had a large quantity of marijuana in the car and some baggies where he had been dealing and a pistol. So in Florida in those days, that's definitely some jail time. Mike was sitting in his car when a black car pulled up and 4 men got out and walked over to where the other officers were standing and was talking to them. Mike got out of his car and walked over, and one of the officers said, "This is the first officer that was on scene." One of the suit guys asked him if he shot it, and Mike said, "Yeah, it wasn't dead, and I didn't want that thing to get up." Mike said he asked them what the hell that thing was, and they basically ignored him. And then he said, "Who are you guys?" And one guy turned and said, "It's none of your business who we are." And then he said a big white box truck pulled up, and more guys in black cars pulled up. Mike said the supervisor came and told him that these guys were taking over and that we could leave. Mike asked his supervisor who they were, and his supervisor looked at him and said, "Mike, it's better if you don't know." Mike said the whole situation felt off, and he was sure those other guys were some sort of government entity. They wrapped that thing up in a tarp, and it took 6 guys to pick it up and put it in the back of that truck. They took the boy who was sitting in Mike's car and put him in one of the black cars and drove off. Mike drove back to the station to do a report, and when finished, he put the report in the supervisor's mailbox. He went home and said, "I tried to lay down and sleep, but that he couldn't get that creature out of his mind." He told Dad it was hideous and very, very big, and so he tried to calm his nerves a little with a drink or two. Dad told him he would drive him home and he could get the car the next day, so they left. A few days later, Dad was on the phone with Mike, and after talking to him, my dad told my mom that Mike was very upset because they had said his report had disappeared, and when Mike said he would write another one, he was told no and to forget about the whole thing. They told him no charges would be filed against the boy, and basically the whole thing never took place. Now, Mike had been a cop for over 20 years and took his job seriously, so I know this had to bother him. He told my dad he was going to try and find the boy and that he had a bad feeling about the whole situation. My dad didn't hear from Mike for almost 2 months, which was really out of sorts. And when my dad would call, Mike's wife would say he wasn't there. Finally, Mike called my dad one day and told him they were moving. My dad asked Mike to where, and he said New Mexico, and that he had taken a job with a county department there. My dad asked him why, and all Mike would say is, "I have no choice, Turtle. I have to." Mike moved his family to New Mexico, and this really hurt my dad. Those two had been friends since they were 5 years old, and even enlisted together and went to Vietnam together. They served in different areas, but whenever they got the chance, they would meet up. I think it was just knowing that each other was there that gave them both comfort. Now my dad's best friend was gone, someone who was a second father to me. Our family had been torn apart, and we didn't know why at the time. About 5 years later, my dad went out to see Mike and stayed there for a week, and Mike finally told him what happened. He said he found the kid and talked with him, and he told Mike that those guys in the suits had all the charges dropped as long as he never told anyone about what happened out there. And of course, the kid was more than willing to take that offer. He was probably looking at least a few years in jail. So Mike went to his supervisors to find out what was going on. His supervisor told him to leave it alone and that there were people involved that Mike didn't want to be on their bad side. Now, if you knew Mike, you would know he can't let things go. So he sent a letter to the regional director of the FBI inquiring about the incident or if they knew anything. He never received an answer, and about a week later, some men showed up at his house and told him that he had a new job in New Mexico waiting for him and that he will take it. And his career in Florida was done. And then they said something to Mike that scared him more than anything had ever scared him before. They said, "Oh, by the way, your daughter did great in school today. She's really smart, isn't she?" Mike told my dad he didn't have a choice. My dad understood. And that was the last time they would ever see each other. About a year later, my dad would have a massive heart attack, and he passed away 4 days later. My mom and I were there, and so was Mike. Mike passed away in 2009, and he never spoke of that incident as far as I know ever again. That is the end of this as far as I know, but I never could understand why the secrecy and why try and run a good man's career. Thank you.